honestly, I think we can just hop into it. What do you think, Liz?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will just say, hi, I'm Sam. I'm the president of the DC Science Writers Association. I did not do any of the planning for this. This is all Liz, who I'm going to hand it over to in just a second. I'm just here to say hello. For those of you who are not part of the DC Science Writers Association, I, of course, encourage you to join us. And I will pop back in at the very end of today or at 8:30 just to share an upcoming event and close things out. So Liz, I will turn it over to you and I will mute myself.
Thank you so much, Sam. Well, I'm so excited to be here. My name is Liz Landau. I'm so sorry. My spam is going off. Okay. Hello, I am Liz Landau. It's so great to be here with you all. I'm a science writer in DC. I'm also a multimedia lead at NASA Astrophysics in Washington. And I'm here with two incredible authors of two books that are very different, but both about space and really expand the way that we think about the world beyond our planet. And we're going to talk on a lot of different themes. We're going to talk about the craft of writing a book. We're going to talk about researching a book, but we're also going to talk about the content of these books and the possibilities of life beyond Earth. I think I'm going to start, first of all, with David. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us, what is this book about?
Well, it's really all there in the subtitle, isn't it?
It is an incredible subtitle. Oh my gosh. It encompasses everything. But
I'll share the story of that subtitle for those who don't know, perhaps later on. So my name is David Brown. I am a writer. I live here in New Orleans. I've been doing this for about 15 years now. I've written for a good many places, and I see some names here. I've written for many of you. I've written for you, Jamie. Lately, I've been doing a lot of work for the New Yorker, which has been pretty cool. I also just wrote a feature for Scientific American, and I don't think that'll come out until next year, though. I don't see Lee on this list, so it's in his court right now. I filed it on time. And anyway, it's just such a pleasure to be invited here, and I'm really excited to do this thing and see what happens. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And Jaime Green, can you introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about your book?
Sure. So I live in Central Connecticut. I am a writer and editor. I'm the series editor of Best American Science and Nature Writing, in addition to the author of this guy. I also teach. I teach at Smith and at the Johns Hopkins master's program in science writing. And the possibility of life it's about how we imagine extraterrestrial life through science and through science fiction. So looking at the research, looking at the imaginings in science fiction, and sort of putting them together and seeing what that reveals about what it means to be human. And it is probably half the length of David's book. And the subtitle is less than half the length of his subtitle.
Oh.
Awesome. And at this point, I do want to acknowledge that Becky Boyle was going to join us, unfortunately had a death in her family, but she is the author of a new book called Our Moon that's coming out that David has a copy of. And before we move on, David, could you just say a few words about Becky's book?
Yes. So I had the pleasure of reading it a few weeks ago, and what a tour de force. So her book basically explores, and I can read it. I know there's a little part where we read a little bit. I can read a passage from it. I won't do it justice, but I could certainly try. So Our Moon basically is the ultimate deep dive into where we come from, because the story of the moon is very much the story of life on Earth, and it's the story of the life of the Earth. There's no, as I learned in reading this book, which is so beautifully written, because Rebecca Boyle has just she's like a poet, and every word just feels chiseled on stone. But as I came to learn over the course of reading this book, there's really no area of human life, whether it's the existence of human life itself, but also science, religion, philosophy, science fiction, literature. Obviously, the way we are influenced by everything from the tides to the phases of the moon, animal life, and of course, that extraordinary thing. I came to learn how the moon has affected key military battles in human history, all the way to the greatest achievement in human history, which of course is landing on the moon. So there's just it's I rehearsed this in my head before getting on this call, and I see now I should have rehearsed it out loud. But she just, I can't say enough things. So the title of the book is Our Moon. The subtitle is How Earth's Celestial Companion Transformed the Planet, Guided Evolution, and Made Us Who We Are. And my goodness, she nailed it. So she definitely did the assignment, and I encourage everybody to get a copy in January 16th.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading that one as well. But before we get into some of our readings, I wanted to ask each of you a little bit about the process of writing a book. And I'll start with David. What was the starting point for you here? Like, what just made you decide to write this?
So in the very beginning, I didn't know anything about this mission called Europa Clipper. Actually, there was no such mission as Europa Clipper at the time. It was the Europa Multiple Flyby mission. And it came about over the course of just reporting other stories. I heard someone say, there's this mission to your, I was very early. It took like 7 years to write. So there was I didn't know a lot of stuff when I first started writing it. And someone mentioned in passing, there's this Europa mission, but it's not been going anywhere for the last 15 years, and it's probably not going anywhere now. But maybe you could talk to Louise Proctor at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, and maybe she'll talk to you, but probably not. And so don't feel bad. So I was like, all right, well, and that wasn't for the book. That was just for an article I was writing for Slate at the time, in fact. So I reached out to Louise, and she responded right away, and she said, I've got 15 minutes tomorrow. And I was like, that's great. I can get a quote, right? Because that's kind of what you want when you're doing this. And 2 hours into our 15-minute phone call, she was like, I got a lot more to say about this. And so the next day we talked again. Concurrently, I got in touch with people like Kurt Niebert at NASA headquarters, Bob Papalardo at JPL, who is the project scientist for Europa Clipper. He actually ducked me for the first year because he didn't want anyone screwing up this mission, which was finally getting traction. But once things looked good, he was able to connect with me, and he's become a very dear friend. But anyway, all of this is to say that I find that a big part of this job, and as you all know, is just human connection, right? It's just approaching people in a disarming way, and being genuine, and hopefully hitting things off, and who knows what happens. So I didn't expect that book to happen, and I'm very glad that it did. Definitely a life changer. And what a story to tell, right? I mean, it's not my story, it's their story, and my goodness.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that answers
I will
the
say
question,
at this time as well that since I work with NASA for both of these books, actually, I was like, oh my God, it's Kurt Niebert, it's Jim Green. And then for your book, Jamie, I was like, oh my God, it's Jesse Christensen. Like all these like people who like are the cast of characters, I know as people, and it was really fun to see all of them as, characters in books.
Yeah.
Cool. But Jamie, tell us a little bit about your process. How did you begin? How did you know this was a book?
Yeah, it was a very, very different origin. So I come to this all not with training or like work experience as a journalist, but from creative writing. Like I have my master's in creative nonfiction, and this started as sorry, I got distracted because my face was suddenly very large on my screen. I had my self view turned off, and then I was like, oh, there she is. Okay. In my MFA program, all of the nonfiction students had to do a 1 semester research seminar where we had to spend a semester learning sort of not even reporting, but like research methods, and do a writing project out of that research. And I wanted to write about the Voyager Golden Record. And my professor, you know, I had like read Carl Sagan when I was a teenager and everything. And I had heard the Radio Lab episodes. So I was like, I want to write about the Golden Record. And my professor said, go bigger, write about aliens. And I was like, well, that's a lot bigger. And that was when I started researching this. I talked my way into an undergrad astrobiology class at Columbia where I was getting my MFA. But then I did the thing that a lot of aspiring writers do. And I was like, I'm going to write a book about this. I love this. I want to write a book about it. And I did the thing that a lot of aspiring writers do where you go to the bookstore and you go to the shelf where your future book is going to be and you like visit its spot. And there were already a few books about the search for alien life, about like SETI and astrobiology and all that. And they were all written by astronomers. There's this really weird thing in astronomy, separate from like space science, like not like the NASA and tech side, but like when we're looking at like out at the stars, almost everything, especially when it comes to stuff about alien life, has been written by scientists, which I find really interesting because that's not the case in like biology. But this book existed like 5 times over. So I put it on the shelf in my head. And then a few years later, I got the opportunity to write a series of essays. Because remember, I'm like not working primarily as a journalist. I'm like an essayist and creative writer. And someone asked me if I had an idea for an essay series about culture. And I said, what about aliens, but through a cultural lens? And she said yes. And, you know, Liz, you asked, when did I know it was a book? It was when I was writing the 3rd essay in that series, which was about science fiction imaginings of aliens and what scientists who do this work think of all that. And I just felt like I could keep writing and keep writing. Like the word count was supposed to be like 2,000 words. And it's like 2,500 words, 3,000 words. I just like wanted to keep writing and keep writing. And that was when I realized that I had an exciting way in and a different way in and a way to write about this that hadn't been done before. And it was really from there, you know, writing a book proposal, doing the research for it. I expanded that essay into, you know, a 7,000 word sample chapter, which is now like a 10,000 word chapter in here. And it was really just figuring out what was my version of this book, because, you know, like I had a topic in mind, but a lot of people had written a lot of books on that topic. But whether it's about the angle or the argument or just sort of however you think about it, this was the book that was like my version of this to write. And that was and then luckily someone was willing to give me money to do that, because that was not a guarantee at all.
Totally. And I can sense both of you have a lot of passion for the topics that you have written about. And Jaime, in particular, I was struck by all the integration of science fiction in your book. Was that something that you knew you were going to do originally, or did that come about as you were writing?
That was what I figured out when I was writing that essay, that putting science and science fiction in conversation and seeing what that revealed, that was really interesting to me. And not in terms of like a fact checking, you know, like Star Trek does this, but science says this, but rather than it was like, and it was additive. And it also meant approaching science as an imaginative project, which of course it is. Like when you're thinking about aliens, it's very much about imagining because we don't have any examples. But, you know, coming up with a hypothesis is imagination, because that's the thing about this topic is we don't know. And all of the books, and this is actually the bit that I want to read when we get to that, is like all of the books about this are about trying to answer the question. And that's not a thing for a book to do. That's a thing that hopefully science will eventually do. So figuring out like the function of the book, sci-fi was always going to be part of that.
Awesome. Well, Europa, a moon of Jupiter that has an icy crust and an ocean underneath, is a prime target for the possibility of life beyond Earth. And to go back to David, you know, I wondered, you know, was that one of your drivers for wanting to pursue the Europa mission in particular, or was it something else that kind of attracted you to this topic?
A little of both. I'm definitely driven by sort of the people in my story are usually the thing that I care about the most. I'm probably not a very good science writer, but I think I'm a pretty good human writer. Um, in comparison, the what I loved about the Europa story is that the stakes were so high, right? I mean, if they find life on Europa, there are implications for science and philosophy and religion. Um, it's sort of the deepest and most fundamental human questions that there are, right? Are we alone? Where did we come from? If there is as the subtitle indicates, a second Garden of Eden at the bottom of a alien ocean, circling a swirling ball of liquid metallic hydrogen, well, that's got to say an awful lot about the existence of life elsewhere in the universe. But it was definitely, for me, it was the most compelling. There are a lot of compelling worlds in the solar system and beyond, but there aren't a lot of compelling teams, I don't think. I mean, everybody's interesting in their own way, obviously, but to some extent, falling in love with the people behind this Europa mission who spent decades trying to get this thing going, knowing that it was never going to fly, but doing it anyway. How can you not love the plucky underdog? And for them to succeed in the end was quite nice. One of the great challenges that I thought we were going to have in selling the book was that the book doesn't end with a rocket launch, right? If you're writing a story about a mission going to space, you got to have the rocket launch at the end, and we didn't have that. And when we ultimately sold it to Custom House, which is a HarperCollins imprint, my editor at the time, Jeff Chandler, the first thing he said was, no, the rocket launch is beside the point. We don't care about that. And I didn't care about that either, but I just thought that would be hard to sell. So I was very fortunate to find an editor who got it. There were a few people that we were talking to, but he's the one who truly understood the book and the story that I was trying to tell and the way that I was trying to tell it. I mean, if you've read it, it's definitely it's definitely on the high end of creative nonfiction, I think. But I liked it. I thought it was a good book anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're an amazing science writer. As Jamie, I also think you're an amazing science writer. It's interesting that both of you came from kind of other worlds of writing before you made these books, the successes that they are. And as regards to Europa, God willing, we will launch the Europa Clipper mission next year to Europa. It'll take a long time to get there, but it has been many years in the making, as you say. Yeah, I think at this point, I would love to hear each of you read a passage from your books to give everybody a flavor. I'm going to start with Jamie. Would you like to read us a selection from your book?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to read some snippets from the introduction because, it gives the sort of motivation, the argument for the, now that I'm saying that, I did sort of just explain it. Let me think for one quick second. Yeah, I'm going to read it anyway. Okay, because it's like the most, like, here's what the book is up to. Okay. When I was very little, I was scared of the night sky. I remember hurrying from my parents' car to the front door so that I wouldn't be out in the open too long. I felt like the stars were watching me. But soon enough, the sky became a friendlier place. My dad taught me the names of the constellations and how to find the North Star pouring off the tip of the Big Dipper, a real feat in the light-polluted skies of Queens. And then, a few years later, the idea of a vast cosmos became a promise, not a threat, because it might be full of benevolent creatures. What happened was I started watching Star Trek: The Next Generation. Those are the first aliens I remember. Well, the first I remember loving because I was terrified of E.T., but quickly my world became full of them. Kind Starfleet officers with minor prosthetics to differentiate them from their human colleagues, the sandworms of Arrakis, glowing deep-sea angels in the abyss, Meg Murray's beloved Aunt Beast. There were bad guys and monsters, but there was so much hope too. And while pop culture was populating my imaginary worlds, the science I learned in school and from PBS specials watched on playdates with equally nerdy friends was expanding my sense of what was possible. Rovers landed on Mars, SETI listened for signals, and around when I was 12 years old, the first planets beyond our solar system were found. Some people are drawn to science by their drive to understand, but what I have always loved most is how science shows us what we don't know, how little we understand of the world even as we're inextricably a part of it. I didn't want to answer questions, but discover mysteries instead, mysteries with tantalizing possibilities, theories and hypotheses and whispers of the truth. Yet the question most often, too often, asked about extraterrestrial life is whether or not. The fact is, that's a very boring question. Its answer would be revolutionary, and plenty of scientists are pursuing it. But sitting here posing it to a vast and empty sky doesn't tell us anything. We should really be asking, what if? What if is not a linear path to knowledge, but a circular one, spiraling recursively toward deeper and deeper understanding. When we imagine extraterrestrial life, we strain against the limits of scientific knowledge, going out on a limb and testing its strength, then looking back at ourselves from a new distance. What if makes us ask questions about life on Earth. How did it arise? Why is it the way it is? Are we special, and what would that mean? What is our responsibility with the intelligence and technology that we have? Space is indescribably vast. Planets orbit, stars burn, and the black hole at the center of the Milky Way devours, all without a care for our existence. We're just a speck, just a flicker of matter organizing itself in a funny way for a bit of time. We take our smallness as proof of both our insignificance and our great importance. For all that we imagine, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. It's a terrible burden to contemplate, that this might be the only life in the cosmos. A huge responsibility for such a clumsy species to bear, and such a lonely universe to live in. We want to know if we matter. We want to know what our existence means. Life on another world would give us a context, a foil, a richer way of understanding ourselves. So we search and listen, calculate the odds, but ultimately we can only speculate about how we fit into the galactic picture. Imagining extraterrestrial life is a way of figuring out what it means to be a conscious animal, what it means to be matter and alive. Our visions of space are a reflection of ourselves and of our humanity, like the building blocks of a telescope, a mirror, and a lens.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And actually, I would like to ask you, so the opening of your book, was that something that you had written early on, or was that something that you wrote towards the end of your process?
It's a mix. The like very opening, and I will say this is like there's a lot of me here. It is not a memoir. I am not this present throughout the book. Like, I'm using me as a way in. But that opening was the opening of the introduction to my book proposal. And when I read book introductions, I'm always like, this sounds like the intro and overview of a proposal. And I asked about it on Twitter when I was working on my book proposal, back when Twitter was like functional. And I did a little poll, and most people said that their book introduction bore basically no relation to their proposal introduction. And I think that that's a bunch of lying liars, because they all read like book proposals. They're all like, in this book, I will, here's the motivation. But anyway, so that opening is exactly what the proposal opened with. What's totally different is the part where I'm making an argument for asking what if, where I'm like making the argument for the book. That came in the second draft of the book, because I had given the first draft. When I sent it to my editor, I also sent it to a couple of trusted friends who are very sharp editors. And one of them was like, you've done so much research. You clearly have great mastery of this. You do not have an argument. I can tell that you have an argument, but it is not in the book. And for years, I had been resisting this, like, what's your argument? What's your argument? What's your argument? Like, it's a proposal phase. I was like, it's not an argument-driven book. It's essayistic. It's asking questions. It's exploring. Like I said, kind of a hard book to sell. Also, because it's like weird and in between genres. But yeah, and so I finally sat down and like assigned myself a little, I did it like I would do with my students, where I was like, I'm going to do a 10-minute focused free write on the argument of my book. And within like 2 paragraphs, I was like, oh, the argument is that. So I was basically, I'm going into detail here because I think this might be helpful. I hope I'm not like talking too long. But what I realized was that my book needed to be in conversation with all those other books that were already on the shelf. And so I was thinking, like, what is the terminology from like teaching first year composition is they say, I say. What does everyone else say about this? And what am I saying that's different? And I realized right away that the they say is a part I skipped in the introduction was me talking about the Drake equation, which I realized I accidentally sort of adapted into the structure of the book. And like, no shade on Frank Drake, no shade on the Drake equation, but like the Drake equation is not actually meant to be solved. It's an agenda setting tool. It's a discussion, figuring out the topics. But everyone else is writing about this question is, what are the odds? Is it likely? Is it rare? Here's why I think there's definitely life. Here's why I think we're the only, complex celled life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's like trying to make their prediction. And you can make great arguments for any of it, but like, that's not how you answer this question. So figuring out the argument of the book, which I didn't really change the middle of the book, I just kind of put it at the beginning and the end, really changed that introduction. But I had to write the whole draft and then finally sit down and do this work and figure out like, oh, my book actually does have an argument.
That's so interesting. And David, before we get into your reading, did you feel like you also needed to have an argument? And if so, what was that argument? Oh, sorry, I think you're on mute still.
Good, they gave me time to come up with something. No, I don't know what the argument would be aside from no, I don't know. If there's an argument there, I leave that to the reader.
But I think that makes sense because yours has a narrative and story and characters, which like mine does not at all. And that was another thing. People like wanted scenes and characters, and I was like, the aliens might be the characters. Sorry. So yeah, I don't like, not every book needs an argument, but yours is telling a story. It's very character driven and narrative driven, and mine was definitely not going to be that. So probably need an argument at that point.
Cool. No,
Well, you nailed it though, so yeah.
Awesome. Well, David, how about you share a passage from your book?
So I thought I would do something. I thought I would actually read a passage from my next book.
Okay.
This could be the world premiere. Actually, my agent hasn't even seen it yet.
You heard it here first, everybody. Okay.
Yes. So the next book is titled The Outside Cats, and one of the characters in the mission is Don Blankenship, who is the principal investigator of the radar instrument on Europa Clipper. Although Europa Clipper, I don't even know if it's even mentioned by name in this book, because it came out before then, before KDPB, actually. So anyway, Don I found to be an incredibly compelling human being, one of the most charismatic people I've ever met, in fact. And I only interviewed him for the mission in the last, really in the last, I don't know, 20% of the process. And I knew I needed to talk to him, but I didn't have anything interesting to ask him. For my interviews, I try to ask people things only they could answer. And I just didn't have those questions for him yet. And I didn't want to waste his time. So by the time I talked to him, he just asked in passing, like, hey, what do you want to do next? And I was like, well, I'd really like to write a book about climate change, and particularly what's going on in Antarctica. But I don't know who the guy is you got to talk to get to Antarctica. And he just laughed and said, yeah, good luck with that. And that was the end of our interview. So we had a follow-up like 2 weeks later, and he said, "Hey," and this was at the end, "Hey, were you serious about that Antarctica book?" I was like, "Yeah, I'd really like to do that." And he's like, "Well, you know how you didn't know the guy you got to talk to go to Antarctica? I'm the guy you got to talk to go to Antarctica." And 6 months later, I was in Antarctica. That particular expedition was in Eastern Antarctica. I went back in 2022 to this time. That time was at Casey Station, and we flew there and we did aero geophysical flights from a fixed wing aircraft. The second time I went back, it was on an icebreaker boat with the Korean Polar Research Institute, and we used helicopters to drop sort of probes into the cracks in the ice. And the story that I'm actually telling in the book so the book is a memoir. The story I'm telling in the book is about this, sort of woven into it is this team of sort of outsiders in polar research who really transformed the way we explore the ice today. So a book arose from that. And the part that I'm going to read is like the exact opposite of Jamie. Actually, it's funny. My book is a memoir, but the part you're going to hear has no me in it at all. So I'm glad that we can cover the whole gamut today. So I've never read this out loud before. Again, something I probably should have rehearsed in advance. So if it goes badly, maybe someone just kick me off the Zoom and just say that we had technical troubles later on, and I won't feel too bad. All right. So the world premiere of The Outside Cats. It was late springtime in Casey, Illinois, and hot that day on the back of his dirt bike, the sweat soaking through his helmet, liner, gear, gloves, goggles, 74 degrees at 75 miles per hour. In 1976, the numbers were perfect, and Donald Blankenship was taking a stab at the trolley problem as a practical endeavor, the choices being to cut off a man's head or crash into a crowd of 400. The event itself wasn't that important, the District 17 amateur motocross, sort of race you ran to position yourself in the statewide rankings, a list on which Don, age 22 and riding as 324, hovered usually around 10th or 11th. Illinois was a competitive state with a million tracks between Chicago and East St. Louis because the soil was just right, and there were a million great riders there for the same reason. Each track took the whole of the Pleistocene to make, the Laurentide ice sheet shearing the surface of North America, moving massive mounds of rock one day, and then retreating, spreading glacial till in its wake. South and north it went for eons, a few bulldozers in the 1960s handling the rest. Before dropping out, Don had done a year of geology at Western Illinois University, and that's all dirt bike racing was, really, geology, and he embarked on a form of fieldwork in St. Louis, where the tracks were made from windblown silt, and Cape Girardeau, where they were all sand and gravel, etc. That day on that track, tires gripping the soft till plains of the Prairie State, the sensuous tang of exhaust so thick you could taste it, engines echoing across rollers, whoops, burns, and quads. Don hovered over his seat, a good grip on the throttle, relaxed, index and middle fingers doing the hard work, a little support from the thumb, the legs gripped the bike, not the arms. His posture was perfect, his feet on the foot pegs, his movement clean, his head clear, alert, and he'd been on the lookout for what racers call the GOAT, the guy who absolutely did not belong there, and nobody knew exactly how he got his classification. At the start, the green flag fluttered, the drop gate slapped dirt, and he and a dozen or so riders tore from the line. They weren't the first race of the day, and the track was pretty heinous, with wet, trench-like grooves carved in the dense dirt from 100 wheels. Don had spent a couple hours warming up before the race and felt good down the straightaway and easing into the first turn. The throttle rolled back, speed smeared, and then annihilated the pointless world outside the track's boundaries. There in the topsoil arena, you weren't nervous, you were attentive, you were alive. The truly great motocross racers, Don had come to realize, had this ability to spin reality nearly, this otherworldly power to know the positions of everyone around them, accelerations, slowdowns, tilts on turns, brakes to advanced position, while pushing their own envelopes on a track that tires deform every lap, anticipating the jumps big and small, all while tearing through the mud at interstate highway speeds, inches and sometimes closer to the nearest guy, and one tap, one slip, one rut too far, bolt not tightened, and that's it. The sport breaks a lot of bones because the mind-spun reality of the truly fine racer works really, really well until it doesn't. When Don came around the turn, it happened 1 second, maybe two, maybe less. Crowds love to gather on the big turns on every track. It's just so dynamic there with those deep wheel-carved grooves in the dirt. To stay stable, you sit forward, put more pressure on the front wheel, elbows up, inner leg on the turn straight out, the foot slightly in, eyes looking through the turn. Don's eyes, though, saw trouble feet away. The goat had cashed in, dropped his bike hard, helmet hit dirt, knocked him senseless. Not that there was a lot of time for a sensible reaction anyway, for a goat or otherwise. And there was Don, a split second behind him, wheels in a rut across which the goat's neck now lay outstretched. There was no left or right, only out or through. Everything got slow and quiet after that. The annihilated masses outside the track resolved to smears and then human-shaped blurs. Even in his early 20s, Don was a man of principle, and one of those principles was never sever anyone's head with your beautiful new dirt bike during a District 17 amateur motocross. He popped free from the rut, and his foot slipped from the peg that had made him one in the same with his red bike, and over the high side of the turn they went, impossibly fast, impossibly slow, and it was just lovely, really. He'd never seen a track from that vantage point before. The big sweeping turn, the teeming crowd of spectators scattering, and he's sideways somehow, 75 miles an hour, and this big snow fence that seconds earlier was far away is getting bigger, closer, and Don realized that he was about to reconcile a lot of momentum in a very short distance. He didn't feel any of it, of course, but suddenly a good bit of snow fence exploded into splinters, and something happened to his leg. He wasn't sure what, but he was sure legs weren't supposed to make that sound or move that way. The fence post held, though. He'd migrated it a bit, and then all was still. So, ta-da.
Beautiful. That was so like dramatic, and like I love that. I mean, both of your readings today have been fantastic, but in like very different styles. It's really cool to have the breadth of possibility here. I want to read you guys a question for one of our attendees. Alice asks, were you afraid that in your research for your books that you might miss some really important publication or information? Has that ever happened in your other writing?
Yes, I was terrified of that all the time, because the way, like I mentioned, that my book is sort of structured like the Drake equation. It's 6 chapters, and each chapter is a different category of thing that we need to understand in order to be able to imagine what alien life might be like. So like the first one is called Origin, and that gets into the origin of life. The next one is planets, because life needs somewhere to be. So what are the different ways a planet can be, and how does that affect life, and so on through, biology, cognition, technology, things like that. So each chapter could have easily been a book. And not only do I not have training as a journalist, I also don't have training as a scientist. Like I took that one astrobiology class, which was amazing, and meant that when I was writing the planets chapter, I was like, I've heard of exoplanets, I got this. But I was writing about evolutionary biology, about the origin of life, about linguistics, cognitive science, all of this stuff that I have not only no academic background in, but hadn't really written about ever. I've written about exoplanets, like that's it. So I was terrified of that. And it also meant that I couldn't research each chapter super, super deeply. I could not research exhaustively. It was a lot of good enough research. I was really lucky that I found great experts to talk to. And so the book and the scientific aspects of the book come more from interviews than from papers, because also people aren't publishing journal articles about like, here's what I think an alien animal would be like. Like you get plenty of scholarship about origin of life, exoplanets, but the more speculative it is, the more it's me talking to a scientist and saying like, well, what do you think? Like if you had to guess, what do you think, right? So it's much more interview driven than paper driven. But even still, so much of this is so contentious. And so I luckily had a grant and was able to hire a fact checker who saved me on one aspect where I'd interviewed a couple of experts. It happened to be a field that she knew, and she said, I think that you're getting just one corner and a kind of like fringe, not very mainstream perspective on this. And I was like, she was like, I don't know if this is overstepping. I was like, no, please, please, please. So she really saved me on that aspect. I also, thanks to this grant, before fact checking, hired science readers to read each chapter, specialists in the field, not to be checking specific details, but just as like a gut check. Is anything in here? Am I missing anything? Am I mischaracterizing the field? Am I missing anything major? If you were just reading this, is there anything that makes you go, ooh, that's not really right? And that was really, really helpful too. But you know, I think I'm sure David had a similar thing where like neither of our books is about something that ended when the book ended. And so there would be, I would encounter a new sci-fi novel or the work of a researcher or a cool story and like, oh, I really could have fit that in. Oh, that really should have fit in this chapter. But so you know, there's, you never catch everything and you just sort of do your best. I don't know. It's yeah, Alice. I mean, like I still lose sleep about. I don't actually lose sleep about that. I've made peace with it, but I've had to work very hard to make that peace.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic. Like, what is life beyond Earth? You know, you did an amazing job of encapsulating the essence of that search. But David, let's hear from you. Did you have a fact checker, and did you ever worry that you were missing something about Europa? Or, I mean, you have a lot of NASA history in here.
I just always like one of the I saw, so my undergraduate degree is in computer science, which I took geology as my you had to have a secondary science, and geology was my secondary science, and I took it because I called it rocks for jocks, and I remembered nothing about it. And interestingly, the only two subjects I ever failed in high school, and I actually failed them like legitimately, was chemistry and physics. And then because I'm like, that just doesn't matter to my life. And now all I do is write about chemistry, physics, and geology. Like that actually is, it was like if I told 16-year-old me how things would all turn out, he would have run away and joined the circus, I think. Am I afraid that I'm going to that I've missed something important, critical papers? Yes, always. Perennially in everything that I write, always 100% of the time. Or I mean, you described sort of describing that edge case when that's not the mainstream view, like that frequent. I do it all the time because I don't know what's important, and it's even to the point where you go to conferences and I just have to tell people that I know, like, hey, is that person really important or not? Because I don't know. Like they may have a Nobel Prize, or they may just be someone who showed up off the street. I have no idea. So, you know, Jamie, I know, has the same experience where the longer you're sort of in this, the more people you get to know. But there's always that harrowing. Oh, you know what? I'll give you an example, right? Because when you're writing this thing, right? So there were interviews where I was pulling from 2014 and it was 2020. And so I know a lot by 2020, and I'm writing a chapter and I pull this interview from 2014 when I didn't know anything. And people are telling me solid gold, like they're telling me amazing stuff. And I didn't even know it. I'm like, nah, I don't care about that. Let me ask about this completely pointless, worthless tangent alleyway that makes no difference at all to this world. And, so yes, that is what I do all the time is ask the wrong questions. The good news is I've become very comfortable with, and now it's like a point of pride almost. Like I want to be the dumbest person in the room because I don't bring anything to the table. And so I try to go into these things with a beginner's mind, so that I can absorb it, because there's also the counter argument, which is if you talk to the world's foremost expert on dunes on Titan, he's going to say this is the main thing. But if you talk to somebody else on Titan, they're like, nobody cares about dunes. So it's just a matter of weighing things out and kind of averaging things out over the long term. But yes, to answer your question, I'm always afraid. I'm terrified of everything. I'm waiting for this house of cards to collapse.
I mean, on the topic of like coming into it with a beginner's mind. So I said that I had taken a class on astrobiology. I wrote for Astrobytes for a couple years. So Astrobytes is a website where graduate students write about new research in astronomy and astrophysics aimed at an undergrad audience. And so when I was getting my MFA, I found out about this and I was like, well, it doesn't say you have to be a grad student in astronomy. So I applied and I became a writer there. I'm pretty sure I'm the only MFA student who's ever been a writer for Astrobytes. But so I'd been engaging with the research on exoplanets for a couple of years. I was, and wrote my book. I was like, this one, I sort of know what I'm talking about. And then I hire my science writers. And which chapter do you think is the one that got the most corrections from my science experts? It was absolutely the planets chapter, because I was just writing off the top of my head. I was like, yeah, no, I know what this is. I'm familiar. And he was like, no, that's, you call that a light curve, not a this. And that, you know, like basic terminology that I just got wrong because I thought I knew what I was talking about.
You know, it's a great advantage to that, and I'll say this as well. Like whenever I start any story or book, and I know you undoubtedly teach this in your course. The first question I ask is, who am I writing this for, right? So for the mission, I was like, I'm writing this for my mom, and so every time I came across a science term, I could just ask myself, like, does my mom know what an asteroid is? Like, if she does, then good, I can just press on. If not, I better explain a little bit about what an asteroid is. Does she know what a black hole is? Okay, I can plow forward. And so it's sort of case by case. Like if you're writing for Scientific American, or probably they know what Jupiter is. But if you're writing for People magazine, you might have to say it, comma, a planet. Like,
right.
Yeah, it's so cool to hear you guys say this, because I think that a lot of times when you're in a topic for so many years, you forget that other people don't know the lingo. And I mean, for example, for me, I don't remember the first time I heard the word exoplanet. Like I've just used it for the last 15 years without question, but it's still not a topic. I mean, people, I guess, know that there are planets outside the solar system, but the word exoplanet can really alienate people, pun intended. So, yeah, you know, it's very important to check yourself on, you know, would this particular audience resonate with this kind of language, and you know, is there somebody I could ask, like, would they know about this, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And David, did you say that you also had a fact checker, or did you do your own fact checker?
Oh, the publishers had someone, and they did a good job. I think the main fact that they got, that because I, like, for all the hard science stuff, I'd likewise just engaged friends, and I'm like, just read this and squint a little bit and think about who I'm writing this for. This isn't for the journal Nature, so does this pass muster? And they'd be like, yeah, or no, that's quite terrible. So it you know, there were a lot of corrections there, but the fact checker found the main fact that I remember that they found was that the characters in the book were watching a total solar eclipse from the some sort of bay bridge of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge is where I wrote that they saw it, but it was actually the Chesapeake Bay Bridge tunnel. So that was the main one, and they were very proud to have caught it. Oh, but they introduced the error because I mentioned the Millennium Falcon, and they were like, you need to say, comma, a ship from Star Trek. And I was like, what are you trying to do to me, man? So, yeah.
Both no you don't and no it's not.
Right.
I mean, I can't even like list the number of catches and corrections that my fact checker made. I'm like passionately devoted to her. And so at the end of the book, I write about the nuclear storage warning proposals at Yucca Mountain, and there's another site where these are the places where, you know, this place is not a place of honor. It's become such a meme. The idea that these two long-term nuclear waste disposal sites needed to have signs that would be legible for 10,000 years to far future humans who would know that they should not go digging in there. And there's in all of the popular writing about this, there's so much confusion because there are two sites. There were separate sort of workshops and proposals because they use like anthropologists and artists and whatever. You're thinking about like, how do you communicate to humans who may not share your culture in 10,000 years, but may not share, let alone language, but even like symbols might not make sense. How do you evoke that meaning of don't go here? But it was like this wild game of telephone, and my fact checker actually like, because I was citing like real articles like The Atlantic and things like that, but it had become this game of telephone, which is also what happens where like most nonfiction books are not fact checked because almost no nonfiction publishers pay for your book to be fact checked. it's like David's publisher and Avid Reader Press are like it. Um, and so people are citing things that were not fact checked. And she traced it back. And I was like, Rachel, I think you are literally the only person right now who holds in your head a complete understanding of like what this all correctly is. And I like made all the fixes in my book, but that was one of the biggest knots that she untangled for me, where I was like, I don't know, I cited legitimate looking things, and she was like, I'm digging deeper. She's amazing.
Fact checkers save lives, absolutely.
Yes.
I definitely want to get into the questions that are piling up from our audience. Before that, I just want to super quick ask each of you, from the moment you knew you wanted to write this book to the time it published, how long of a time was that?
It's hard for me to count, because if we go from the like seminar in grad school, that would have been in the winter of 2012, so that was 11 years. If we go from when I wrote that essay, that was probably 2016, so that was 7 years. And then if we go from when I wrote the proposal, it's probably like 4 years.
Cool. And David, how about you?
Very similar. I guess it depends where you start. I think it became, so it took about a year to write the proposal. And then once you get all the way through the final round of edits, it was about 7 years. So that was like all I did was think about that book for 7 years. And one thing I will say is I had a different agent when I was writing the proposal for it. And she told me at the beginning, like, you're going to hate me by the time by the time it's time to sell this proposal.
And you did so much that you broke up with her.
She's like, you're going to fire me. And I was like, no, I'm a really nice guy. And I'll be damned if I fired her before we sold the book and got someone else. I hated her guts by then. But she was right. What was interesting, though, so in retrospect, I feel bad about this, because like 5 years into the project, you know how like suddenly it's like, woe is me, this is it's all falling apart, today's the day when it all ends. And so I just sat down like as a coping mechanism. I was like, well, let me just write what the book should be, and I'll just start from the beginning. I'll just like write, okay, we need to talk about this, I'm gonna talk about this, I'm gonna follow this story, and this story all the way through the end. And what I came up with was exactly what the proposal was like, and that was not intentional. So she really made me think through these themes and the story that I was trying to tell, and the motivations of everyone, and the stakes every step of the way in every chapter. And no, it was it was 7 years is the answer that I usually give. This next book, I vowed that I would do it much quicker, and it's probably on track to be about 6. So I hope. Yeah, so I got it. My editor left the publisher, and I was assigned a new one. And every day I hope that they forgot that I'm actually on contract, so I can just keep writing, because one day I'm waiting for that email that's like, where is it? And I'm like, it's not coming to you yet. Like, today's not the day. So yeah, we'll see.
Well, I definitely get from both of you that you really have to pick a topic that you love, that you are going to persist with for several years, and just, despite all adversity, keep going on the one theme that you love. So very cool. I'm going to go to some audience questions. So Leanne asks, at a DCSWA field trip, we got to sit in at a conference table where the Drake equation was presented and made real. This was a pivotal moment for me when I was truly awed and impressed by the work of a scientist. Which scientists do both of you singularly respect because of something you saw or did relating to them? What made it real for you?
I don't know, David. Do you have one?
God, I'm writing a book about some of these people. I don't know if
I
I
know.
can answer this question. I will say one that I didn't expect was Jonathan Lunine at Cornell.
Oh, he's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, when I interviewed him, I was like, you got 20 minutes? Because I didn't have anything to say. And I always have like a standard set of questions that I ask people to sort of loosen them up. Like I don't need it, but I just want them to like me and to engage some part of their brain that's not scientists talking to journalists mode, but more like, whoa, that's really cool. Now I'm a human talking to a human. And I won't say what the question is because I got to have some professional competitive advantage
Okay,
here.
but please do email it to me because I could use that.
I'll get with you offline. We got
Okay.
this. And the question I didn't ask, he answered immediately. It's like, well, before I answer this question about Titan that is so beneath me, because it was, he said, let me tell you a little bit about my background. And he had one of the most moving stories I'd ever heard. So Carl Sagan's in the subtitle of the book. Let me just read it to you. I'm sorry for doing this. The mission, or how a disciple of Carl Sagan, an ex-motocross racer, a Texas Tea Party congressman, the world's worst typewriter saleswoman, California mountain people, and an anonymous NASA functionary went to war with Mars, survived an insurgency at Saturn, traded blows with Washington, and stole a ride on an Alabama moon rocket to send a space robot to Jupiter in search of the second Garden of Eden at the bottom of an alien ocean inside of an ice world called Europa. A true story. Yes, there you go. The Carl Sagan is mentioned very prominently in there, and that was an accident. Like I had no intention of mentioning Carl Sagan at all because what's he got to do with the exploration of Europa? And people just independently kept bringing him up in stories. And so finally, it was like I was very moved by how influential he was for an entire generation of eventual scientists. And I found it a very deep experience. When I wrote the book, I kind of used the Iliad as a loose literary model for it. And in a sense, Carl Sagan is one of two or three characters in the story who are sort of Olympian on Mount Olympus almost. Like they just dally in the story, make a little influence, and then go away. But that grammar was horrible, but you get the idea. Anyway, so he had a beautiful Carl Sagan story. But Lunine just kept delivering. Like later I found out that he felt terribly guilty because I was bringing up things that he did that he was no longer proud of. And so he's apologizing to people at conferences. Jonathan, if you're watching this, I think you're amazing and I love you. And I just find it so beautiful that he was so vulnerable when we talked. And I think that's more impressive to me than anything else, is one willing to be vulnerable when speaking to a stranger, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say, David, I was so impressed by, all the ways that you were able to get into people's personal lives in this book. Again, people that I pass in the hallway, but I had no idea their personal stories, and they really opened up to you in amazing ways, and the way that tragedies in some cases have shaped their lives. So it was really fascinating.
Took a lot of wine.
But that's how you want it. Yeah. I do want to get to more questions from our audience. Dan Falk asks, Jamie, just curious, what was the grant? And David, did you also have a grant for both authors? Would the absence of a grant have prevented your project from going ahead?
Yeah, so I had a Sloan Book grant, which would not have, its absence wouldn't have prevented the book from happening, but that grant meant that I didn't have to be working full time while I was writing the book. I was able to essentially, I was freelance, so I was essentially working half time on the book. It also funded the fact checker. My acceptance to Sloan, it was very funny and very humbling, where they were like, we'd like to give you the grant, but we would only if we can add a little bit of money to the grant to pay for a science expert reader. And I was like, yes, I understand. I don't have a PhD. It's fine. And that was a huge help, because this is a weird book. It was even weirder as a book proposal. So I did not get a lot of money for it, because it was just like, we like it, but we don't know what's going to happen with this book, so I was not able to live on my advance or anything. So I still would have written the book without the Sloan grant, but it would have been, the book would probably have been worse, and I would have been unhappier.
And
I
Dave, did you have a grant or anything?
I did not get a grant. I had the advance, so
Cool.
it was a good one.
Yeah,
hear,
it
good to hear.
happens.
Let's see. One anonymous attendee asks, could you dip into your research process? How do you start and how do you organize your information?
This is my favorite thing. So it's been dormant for a while, but in addition to like my university teaching, I also teach some like writing classes. And one of them is I teach a seminar on Scrivener because I am so obsessed with it and with using it like as for organizing all of my stuff. I mean, in terms of the informational research process, I start by sort of wandering through the desert, trying to like get a foundation, wasting a lot of time. And then the deadline is looming and I say, oh shit, I gotta get going and start interviewing people. At least I talk about this like it's like a process. This is how it worked for one book. I've written one book. Although I, seem to be doing a similar like, oh, I don't know, I'll read this sort of wandering right now. But yeah, so it's just like something that actually helped me when I was getting started. So the professor of that astrobiology class that I took is Caleb Scharf, who is an author in his own right. And I didn't know this at the time, but I think that's a big part of why he let me into the class. And he has been a really precious resource for me throughout. So when I decided that I was going to start working on the book, I interviewed him and I was like, all right, Caleb, like I need the lay of the land. Like, what is the state of the field? And so having someone where you can get that sort of broad informational interview, especially if you're going into a field where you're not already super connected and knowledgeable, that was really helpful because I was like, who should I talk to? Who's doing interesting, exciting work? Who's doing weird work on the fringes that I want to talk to them so I don't just get like the sort of more mainstream point of view. But then like organizing it, and I see that in the question someone else asked about documenting interviews, almost everything for me happens in Scrivener. My questions for the interview, the transcript, all of my PDFs, like Scrivener, you can put documents in there. So every PDF, all the notes on the PDFs, all of my drafts, all of my free writes, everything is in Scrivener. My Scrivener file for my book is like my precious child. It almost crashes my computer every time I open it. But I just find that really creates an extent. It's so well organized that it like creates an extension of your mind. So you don't have to remember things. It's all there. And that frees up mental space for like creativity and inspiration and writing a sentence in an interesting, pleasurable way, because you're not thinking, oh, who said that? Oh, wait, now I have to go find the quote. Like you just sort of have it all available. So yeah, I could have written this book without the grant, probably could not have written this book without Scrivener.
Cool. That seems like a great plug for Scrivener, which I have not personally used, but sounds awesome. David, what do you use?
I would like to attend that seminar. So for tracking science papers and just general journalism, I use Zotero because it's just an easy plugin and it saves it makes a copy of every website that I need. So I just hit save and it tries to populate the citation. So when I have to do a footnote, it's very easy. In terms of organization, I just folders, interviews with generic names like interview 3894.2 and then I'm listening to all of them panicking years later. I'm just making this up as I go, and I don't have a system even after all this time. When I try to start intentionally with the system, I fail miserably. But Zotero has been very useful for me because I find that all right, so here's an interesting fact. Carl Sagan wanted to put on the Viking lander a strobe light because if they were animals, they might scurry up to it, and that's the kind of thing that you'd want to catch because nobody knew, right? But I couldn't find that I'd read it somewhere, and it probably took a year before I stumbled across it again because my organization skills are so poor. But now if I see something, I just hit click save, it makes a copy of it and I'll find it later.
That's awesome. Definitely going to check out Scrivener and Zotero. Jennifer, another attendee, also had a similar question. Are there other apps that you all use, or are those the only ones?
I mean, I use Otter for transcription, because even with a grant, I was not paying a human transcriptionist for everything, unfortunately. But yeah, it's just Scrivener, because like Zotero lets you manage citations. You can save PDFs and annotate and highlight them and put notes on them. Scrivener does all that, and then also has all your drafts, which I find really helpful for writing, because I don't necessarily write in order, and I like to be able to sort of like move things around. And so Scrivener is very flexible with that also. So it, saves printing paper. So it's really just Scrivener, the love of my life.
I will blow everyone's mind with something when I say that there's something better than Otter, because I used it for years, right? And I'm paying my $20 a month for Otter.
Got really expensive.
And it's so slow. Like it was just miserably slow. To like when you pull up an interview, or maybe it's just my computer's garbage. I don't know. But so there's this program. So there's this AI translation program called Whisper. And I don't know if it's related to OpenAI or what, but there's a Mac version of it where you don't have to do command lines and all that stuff. And it's called Mac Whisper. And it's $20, or was $20 when I bought it. And it is the most extraordinary transcription I've ever seen, to the point where, like, if you're talking to somebody and there's a dog barking in the background, like it'll just put in brackets like dog barking and then just moves on. And it does multiple languages, and you can have different. So you could have like a quick and dirty transcript that's at low resolution, I guess, and it'll do like just a bad job, all the way to like a large language model where it's like insanely good, even with very scientific things. It's not perfect, but nothing's perfect. But it's very inexpensive, $20, right? I mean, even I can afford that, and I exported everything out of Otter, one file at a time, because it won't let you export. It's criminal. And I had to and I imported each of them, and I've been very satisfied. It's a little different. Like there's a little learning curve, but I've been very happy about that. So there you go. That's it. It's Mac Whisper and Zotero and prayer. Prayer is a big part of
The other thing for me is like having a running notes app file on my phone where just like any stray thought goes in there. And you have to make sure that every so often you check it, but like being able to capture stuff and never think like, oh, I'll remember that, because you won't. And you shouldn't expect yourself to.
Definitely. Well, thank you all for taking us into the future, because I'm still using Google Docs for everything. It's really bad. I should get myself on Scrivener probably.
Google Docs is a hostile work environment. Every time I'm just astonished by the well-respected publications that require it. It's just unbelievably awful. Maybe it's because I'm 44 and I just started with Word Perfect, but it just seems to me that Microsoft Word is just where it's at, and everyone who's with your clouds and all your stuff, I have no time for you.
All right, well, let us move on to our next question from Leanne. How do you document your interviews? Do you record them? Do you send a preliminary version of what you might ask to the interviewee ahead of time? Any other advice for interviews?
I give a very general, like, I would love to talk to you about your research into the origin of life, like that level. And yeah, I don't really take, the only notes I take during an interview are gestures, visual things, thoughts that I'm having. I sort of lean on the transcript. I record through Zoom because I trust that. I mean, I don't use a physical recorder. This is the other thing, is I did almost all of my book research and writing during the pandemic. I had one research trip in January of 2020 where I like had my little recorder and I went to the labs and I saw the stuff and I took pictures and everything, meeting a bunch of researchers in California. And that was January 2020. And then everything else, every other interview I did was over Zoom, which really changed the book because it meant I didn't have scenes. I didn't have that very traditional science journalism thing of I'm in the lab, I describe the researcher and their colorful Hawaiian shirt, and they hand me the bug and I hold the bug and then I write about the science of the bug, right? Like that's a format that we're really used to. And that is like where a book like mine would get characters, because it's not about people's stories, but you would get scenes. There are no lab scenes at all in the book. It did bring it more into the creative nonfiction essay type territory because it was idea driven rather than scene driven. But so yeah, I recorded almost every interview that is. I think there's one quote from Seth Shostak at the SETI Institute that was from a lunch that we had, but every other quote in this book is from a Zoom interview, which is just wild to think about. So yeah, sorry, that was a big tangent, but was like a really interesting, constraint on the writing. But I do really like Zoom's recording built in. And then I use Otter, and I have this really elaborate processing process for all of my research, including interviews, where in Otter, before I start correcting the transcript, I go through and highlight the important parts, and then I only correct the highlighted parts. I export the highlights into a document that I put in Scrivener. Then I go through and highlight again, narrowing it down, winnowing it down. And then I often will organize the quotes by subject matter or theme. I also do this with notes that I take on books or from PDFs, because then you're in control of the order of the information. You're not following the chronology or the order in which someone put the information in a book. You sort of organize it by how you're going to use it. And doing that multi-step process is something that I developed over the course of working on my book, but it was so helpful in really taking control of the material, finding connections, using it the way I needed to use it, not the way someone else framed it. And then I have that to write from. So it takes a lot of time, but it means that once you're writing, it's sort of been knocking around in your head, and it's like, it's more accessible. And I see that someone mentioned in the chat that Carl Zimmer, who I also think is wonderful, starts a lot of his chapters. Ed Young does this too. Two of our greatest science writers. It's a familiar, they're using the structure so expertly where they give you that human connection. You get the writer embodied in the scene with them. They become an audience surrogate. They're reacting to the bug. It works really well for bio. Like obviously like Carl and Ed are using that because they're in labs looking at animals, where I'm like in a lab looking at a lens. And it's like, no one cares about what but yeah, it's, I'm sure a lot of people think it's a shortcoming that my book doesn't work like that. My book probably would have gotten a higher advance if it was going to work like that. But that's why I'm like a weird MFA person and not a science journalist. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm all tangents now. It's after 8 p.m.
It's all good. No, I mean, Jamie, I would argue that the scenes from your book are actually scenes from science fiction.
Right.
Which I was honestly not expecting at all, but really enjoyed. I mean, you took us from Star Trek to various sci-fi novels that I have not actually read, but kind of want to now. And
yeah,
it was very cool.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely like deliberate, where I was like, oh, these are the scenes. The characters are not the scientists. The characters are the aliens. And that helped me figure out how my book worked.
Totally. And David, I mean, you spent a lot of time at my former workplace, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, doing your interviews in person. Tell us about that, and how did you prepare for that, and what kind of advice would you give people doing on location interviews?
I don't tell anybody what we're going to talk about. Like I assume, I might exactly like Jamie, like, yeah, Bob, I want to talk to you about Europa. Like, I'm not going to talk to him about Mars. So that's about as much as I give them. And I'm like, here's the other stuff that I've done. This is what I do. So that way they feel like they have some power, like they have some knowledge or to be armed with. But I try not to I don't like to tip my hand at all. And I couldn't have written a book on Zoom. Like I couldn't have done it. I would have I I would still be in a fetal position rocking in a corner if I had to do that, because I it just, so a lot of the interviews that I do, I try very hard for these big book interviews, for like just like journalism, like I don't know, for a magazine or something, like that's very short turnaround. Like you can get what you need in short order and easily across multiple quick conversations or seeing something or whatever. But for a book where like 5 years from now, this interview will still matter a lot. So I need to get as deep as I possibly can with people. These interviews tend to be about 3 hours each. And in person,
Wait,
you
I'm
can
sorry,
do,
did you say 30 hours?
oh no, 3 hours
Oh,
each,
okay,
like at a time. No, we do sleep. I mean, now there may be 30 hours of it. Like with Don, I have so many interviews right now because this book, a big part of it is his story. But so I interview people for a living, right? So 3 hours into an interview, I'm as fresh as I was 3 hours ago, because I also knew what I was going to ask, and I knew the places where they might lie, or where they may exaggerate, or what they might want to hide, because I know that he doesn't get along with him, and so there's a little rivalry there. So I know all the secrets already. So the first hour of every big interview like this, particularly with someone I've never interviewed before, they are very good. They have the armor on, right? They're good at giving the right answer, right? They're great at giving the right answer. So I went to NASA and we did this, and everyone got along great, and this happened, and it was wonderful in the end. And I'm like, that's great. Second hour, they're a little tired because they don't do this all the time. Like when you get interviewed, it's an exhausting experience, even if it's just a half hour. So, hour two, the armor's off a little bit. It's like, well, he was kind of wrong about that, but whatever. And yeah, that guy pushed back, but it was whatever. And then hour three, they're tired, like they're worn out. And that's when you finally get the stuff you can actually use for the book, I found. So my methods tend to be like for all the JPL interviews that I did, nothing of meaning was ever done at JPL. A lot of it's like, man, what are you doing tonight? You want to grab drinks? You want to go get a burger? And that's when I start wearing them down. But so to answer that, so yes, I always record those interviews because you have to reference them so far away. For magazine or web journalism, I never record. I just take notes for a lot of reasons, but it's I find that it works better for my process that way. I mean, we've all over researched a 2,000-word story, right? Yeah, we just do it. So I have too much work to do. I can't do that. And I mean, between you and me, and don't tell anyone, if you're just taking notes, sometimes a certain tense in the story might be better if that was past tense, and I just didn't keep track. I'm pretty sure they said past tense, and now it flows a whole hell of a lot better in the prose. So I don't know. I don't know if that's ethical or not, but I don't consider myself a journalist, so it's fine.
Well, thank you for pulling back the curtain there on that. And we have an anonymous question that's quite relevant, actually. Do you think it's ever possible to get Zoom interviews to have scenes, or is that out of the question? Like, is there any way that you could write a scene from a Zoom interview?
So
Jamie,
just,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I just said, because that's like a 2-second answer, and it was I can't know but what the point that I was making with the 3-hour interview was, in person you can do that, but you try to get somebody to sit in this square box on a computer screen for 3 hours, like it's just uncomfortable. Everyone, it's just miserable. And I can see when their eyes are moving because they're checking their email instead of listening to me, or when they're just looking at their own face instead of like thinking or, musing at the stars. So I can't do it. Like I mean, I do it when it's necessary, and if I need to build a scene, then I'm like, okay, so we're gonna go there. So what did you have for lunch? Okay, so did you have your lunch with you? Okay, you were at your desk. What color is your desk? Do you have any toys on your desk? Okay, and so we do all that, and I let them know that it's be pedantic, and they tend to be okay with it. But I can't. I mean, that's hard. Zoom is the worst. It's I rather the telephone.
Oh, see, I don't know. I've like gotten used to it. And I think part of this is also David and I like not only wrote such different books, but used interviews so differently. Like I wasn't trying to get at any, like I just wanted to hear what people thought, and that was fine. Like there's no, no strife, I mean, in the chapter on the origin of life, maybe a little, because that is like a wild field. But for the most part, it was like, I almost never had to ask something off the record or on background or whatever. It was like all very just sort of like chilling up front. I did have one situation where someone on Zoom had described how their research works, and I was writing the chapter and I was like, I have no idea what he's talking about, because he wasn't describing the lab literally. He was like, well, the robot does this and it mixes some whatever. And I was like, can we get back on, and can you take your camera to your lab and show me, or like your phone, and just like say like, well, this is where the solution is and it comes through here, so I basically did a virtual lab tour, because when we were on Zoom and he was explaining his research, I was like, yeah, no, that makes sense. And then I was like, wait, I don't actually understand what he said, because he described it not in shorthand, but like just sort of at a remove. It wasn't literal. There was a lot of science journalism published that was reported during the pandemic. A lot of people acknowledged Zoom, talked about talking to people over Zoom, what you see behind them. I've referred to someone once in an interview gestured at her. She was home and she gestured at her kid's Lego collection behind her to make a point. And I was like, yes, a scenic moment. Thank you. That helped a lot. But I feel like it's so funny that it's me and David talking, because we're on such opposite ends of stretching science journalism into these narrative human stories, or into these sort of idea-driven essays. Which is not to say that David's work isn't idea-driven, but like I just like don't have like human relationships other than like me and my mom in a footnote. So yeah, I mean, like, there are moments where I describe someone like leaning towards, I think I say she leaned forwards. I don't think I acknowledged that the camera was there, but I think it's possible. I just, instead of trying to do it, just wrote a totally different kind of book.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to make sure that I got to ask y'all, what was the most challenging part of writing your book? Was there a moment where you just felt like you had to put your head in your hands, like, I don't know how I'm going to get through this and deliver this draft?
For me, I remember I wrote the first chapter, and it was hard. Like it was really hard, and I thought, well, at least once I get through the first chapter, like I can go. I have I have some trajectory happening. So it was really hard, and then I wrote it, and then I was like, okay, chapter 2, and it was really hard because it was like, well, now what? Like I already did the interesting thing in the first chapter. Now I gotta slaved over that, and then chapter 3. I was like, well, this is really hard because the reader probably hates the book at this point. They probably hate me, and they regret spending the money on it. And everyone's miserable. My editor is going to hate me, right? And then I did chapter 4, and so every chapter was the hardest chapter by far. All of it. There was no easy part in the book at all. And I remember when I submitted the manuscript when it was finished, because because you know those last like 3 weeks when you're so close and you're just like, this is all I'm doing 24/7, and you're putting in 18-hour days, and then you finish it. And I was, because I'd pictured that day for years, and I was like, I was married at the time. I was like, we're gonna go out to dinner, and we're gonna go get champagne. And I submitted it to my agent. I was like, if I die, don't let them fuck up chapter 1, because that was the one I cared about the most, or the last chapter. Don't mess those two up. But that was it. And we went to dinner, and by the time like the main course came, I was so sick. Like my immune system had been so suppressed during that final run that to finally be able to breathe, it's just like I was sick for like 2 weeks. So it's all hard, and then it just gets, then you got to actually, by the time you sell it, that's the worst part too. Like there's really no not worst part. It's all bad. Don't do this. Why would you do this to yourself?
Because it's the best. It's the absolute best thing that you can do. I once again have a totally different answer. So I sold the proposal when I was 5 months pregnant. Signed the contract when I was 2 or 3 weeks postpartum. Took a brief maternity leave, got back to work, was having trouble getting going, went on that research trip in January of 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And so I wrote this book. The hardest thing was writing this book with a baby during a pandemic. My son is 4.5 now. And so like, I still have a lot of complicated feelings that I literally am in therapy to talk about. When I hear someone say that they're working all weekend or doing 18-hour days, I fucking can't, because of choices that I made. But like, my day ends at 5:30, right? Like, and my weekends are devoted, and like, yes, I can like work late or steal a weekend. Like I worked weekends throughout October, you know, but it like is very, very different, and is like a real break glass in case of an emergency situation, when that means that your partner is then like hanging out with a 4-year-old for 48 hours. 4-year-old who we love, but come on. So like, yeah, like writing this during the pandemic with a child was, you know, like when he was in daycare, there would be a COVID exposure and we would have no childcare for 10 days.
Mhm.
And it was like a lot of stuff like that, where it's like, okay, I'm not working for 10 days now. You know, like it was just the instability, the constant low level panic attack. And like, it was so disorienting trying to like figure out what, like there's that whole like loss of identity that happens after you have a baby, and you have to sort of build it back up, and doing that while doing this insane, isolated, massive creative project. It was just that was really hard, but I did it. And I still think that like writing a book is like by far my favorite, the best like kind of writing that you can do.
Wow, thank you both so much for being so open and vulnerable about the pitfalls and challenges of this process. I know that we are at time, but I kind of don't want to end on that note. We end on super quickly from each of you. One thing that you wish that you had known about writing a book, like what would you go back and tell your former self, 7+ years ago, if you could go back and tell them something?
Jamie, go first. I gotta think about this one.
Mine is start writing right away. Don't wait until you feel like you've done enough research, even if it's just at the end of every workday, a half-hour free write, just sort of brainstorming, making connections, talking about what you've read. I had to really rip the Band-Aid off that way to start writing, because you're never going to feel like you've researched enough. It's just not going to happen. You're going to have to write the whole book not having researched enough. So day to day, do that sort of low stakes for you, capturing your thoughts, writing. And when that tricks you into getting over the hump of starting writing, and then you're like, oh, those few paragraphs actually could go in the draft. And you ease yourself in that way. But start writing as early in the process as you can.
I think that's brilliant. That's fantastic advice. I wish I had taken it years ago.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah. I don't know. I think I would just let myself know early on, like you're gonna live in this universe of this book for so many years. And all you're gonna do is think about it. When you're not working on it psychologically, you're working on it. When you're dreaming about it and whatever, you're doing everything else. You're at a restaurant and you're like, oh, I gotta remember to do this. It's just your life's gonna fall apart because of it. But nobody else cares. It's not their universe. So you've got to, when the book finally comes out, like you got to understand, like that's one of the 10,000 books at the bookstore that you didn't even notice. And that's everybody. Like, I mean, there's like, and so I would have told myself, like, understand that this is your world and your little homespun immortality, and that's great, but it's just yours. And if you take that sort of approach to it, where this exists for its own sake, and I hope other people like it, then I think that the process itself will be more pleasurable, or would have been more pleasurable for me the first time. Or the last
That's
time.
a perfect note to end on. Again, we have the mission with ridiculous subtitles, and we have the possibility of life. 2 amazing books, and we've had 2 amazing panelists talking about them. Thank you both again so much for sharing your wisdom, and as my friend Dan says in the chat, for being real about the love-hate relationship that you have with this very strange business that is book publishing. Thank you again. I'm going to kick it over